Have you ever felt that quiet shift inside when you pause long enough to notice yourself? The way you acted, the way you spoke, the way you showed up or didn't. This cluster explores those moments when reflection becomes a mirror, when our inner world turns inward and we face the emotions that shape our identity. These are the emotions that surface when we self-assess: the softening, the swelling, the tightening, the instinct to grow, hide, or make things right.
Welcome to the Heart's Compass, a journey through the landscapes of human emotion.
When we self-assess, our emotions become guides, shaped by our values, our history, and the deep human need to understand ourselves with honesty and compassion. This cluster explores the feelings that rise when we look inward: the grounding of humility, the warmth of pride, the inflation of hubris, the gentleness of self-compassion, the pressure of perfectionism, the ache of guilt, and the weight of shame. Humility, the grounded awareness of our strengths and limitations, allowing us to stay open, teachable, and connected. Pride, the warm, steady feeling that rises when we recognize our own effort, growth, or integrity. Hubris, the inflated sense of superiority that masks insecurity and distances us from others. Self-compassion, the gentle, supportive stance we take toward ourselves when we're hurting, struggling, or imperfect. Perfectionism, the internal pressure to meet impossible standards, driven by fear of failure, judgment, or inadequacy. Guilt, the emotional signal that we've acted out of alignment with our values, inviting repair and responsibility. Shame, the heavy belief that something is wrong with who we are, pulling us into hiding and disconnection. Here, emotion is not just reaction, it's reflection. These experiences reveal how we evaluate our choices, how we hold ourselves accountable, and how we navigate the delicate space between growth and self-judgment. Humility. Humility arrives as a softening, a gentle shift inward that quiets the ego and opens space for honesty, learning, and perspective. It's the moment when you recognize your limits without shame, your strengths without exaggeration, and your place within something larger than yourself. It doesn't collapse like shame or inflate like pride. It balances. It creates a grounded clarity that whispers, "I don't have to be more or less than I am." Humility is the feeling that says, "I can grow because I'm willing to see myself clearly." Humility is the emotional posture of acknowledging your strengths and limitations with honesty, openness, and curiosity. It emerges when you release the need to prove yourself, when you recognize the value of others, or when you understand that learning is more important than being right. Humility simplifies the moment by removing defensiveness, allowing you to see yourself and the situation with clarity. At its core, humility is the emotion that says, "I am enough as I am, and I am still becoming." Humility is the quiet grounding that settles in when you stop performing and start listening, when you let go of comparison and return to your own path. It is the emotional spaciousness that forms when you recognize that your worth isn't tied to perfection, achievement, or superiority. Where pride elevates and shame diminishes, humility centers, bringing you back to a place of balance, honesty, and presence. It is the moment when you admit you don't know something and feel relief instead of embarrassment, when you acknowledge a mistake and feel growth instead of guilt. Humility can soften your defenses, making it easier to hear feedback, repair relationships, or take responsibility without collapsing into self-criticism. It can make you more open, more curious, more connected, not because you think less of yourself, but because you no longer need to protect an image of who you think you should be. And yet, beneath this groundedness lies a deeper truth. Humility often emerges where you've learned that strength isn't loud, that wisdom isn't rigid, and that growth requires honesty more than certainty. It is the emotion that reveals your readiness to evolve, to learn, to listen, to expand beyond your current understanding. Humility becomes insight when we recognize that we don't need to have all the answers. It becomes strength when we allow ourselves to be teachable, open, and receptive. And it becomes connection when we show up authentically, without pretense or performance. May we learn to meet humility with gratitude, not as a diminishment, but as a doorway to growth, clarity, and deeper relationships. For beneath every moment of humility lies a longing for truth, balance, and wisdom. A longing that becomes more powerful when paired with curiosity, honesty, and care. Pride. Pride arrives as a rising, a warm lift in the chest, a sense of alignment between who you hope to be and who you're becoming. It's the moment when your effort, integrity, or growth becomes visible to you, when you recognize your own progress without minimizing it. It doesn't inflate like hubris or collapse like shame. It affirms. It creates a grounded confidence that whispers, "I worked for this, and it matters." Pride is the feeling that says, "I am allowed to acknowledge my own strength." Pride is the emotional recognition of your accomplishments, values, or growth. The internal acknowledgement that you've done something meaningful or become someone you're proud of. It emerges when your actions align with your intentions, when you overcome difficulty, or when you honor your own effort. Pride simplifies the moment by centering your worth, reminding you that your contributions and progress are real. At its core, pride is the emotion that says, "I earned this, and I can stand in it." Pride is the quiet glow that forms when you see yourself clearly, not through comparison, but through truth. It is the emotional grounding that comes from honoring your resilience, your discipline, your courage, or your growth. Where humility softens and hubris inflates, pride steadies, anchoring you in a balanced sense of self. It is the moment when you finish something difficult and feel the weight lift, when you look back and realize how far you've come, when you allow yourself to feel worthy of your own achievements. Pride can strengthen your sense of identity, making it easier to set boundaries, pursue goals, or trust your own voice. It can make you stand taller, speak more clearly, or show up more fully. Not because you think you're better than others, but because you finally recognize your own value. And yet, beneath this rising lies a deeper truth. Pride often emerges where you've worked quietly, persisted through difficulty, or grown in ways no one else fully saw. It is the emotion that reveals your capacity to honor yourself, not through comparison, but through authenticity. Pride becomes insight when we recognize the moments where we've shown courage, integrity, or growth. It becomes strength when we allow ourselves to stand in our accomplishments without shrinking or exaggerating. And it becomes connection when we share our progress with others in ways that inspire rather than overshadow. May we learn to meet pride with openness, not as arrogance, but as a celebration of the truth of who we are becoming. For beneath every moment of pride lies a longing for recognition, meaning, and self-respect. A longing that becomes more powerful when paired with humility, honesty, and care.
Hubris. Hubris arrives as an elevation, a swelling of certainty, a tightening around your own perspective, a sense that your view is the only one that matters. It's the moment when confidence tips into overconfidence, when self-assurance becomes self-inflation, when the desire to be right outweighs the desire to be real. It doesn't affirm like pride or balance like humility. It distorts. It creates a brittle superiority that whispers, I know better than everyone else. Hubris is the feeling that says, my worth depends on being above, beyond, or ahead. Hubris is the emotional experience of inflated self-importance, the belief that your abilities, insights, or value exceed those of others. It emerges when insecurity hides beneath confidence, when vulnerability feels dangerous, or when being wrong feels intolerable. Hubris simplifies the moment by narrowing your perspective, making it harder to see nuance, receive feedback, or acknowledge limits. At its core, hubris is the emotion that says, I must elevate myself to feel safe. Hubris is the emotional armor that forms when the ego feels threatened, the protective shell that insists on certainty, dominance, or superiority. It is the internal performance that masks fear with bravado, doubt with confidence, and vulnerability with control. Where pride steadies and humility softens, hubris inflates, stretching your sense of self until it becomes rigid and fragile. It is the moment when you dismiss others' perspectives, when you cling to being right, when you mistake volume for truth or certainty for wisdom. Hubris can distort your relationships, making collaboration feel unnecessary, feedback feel offensive, and disagreement feel like a threat. It can make you push harder, speak louder, or take bigger risks, not because you're fearless, but because you're afraid of being seen as anything less than exceptional. And yet, beneath this elevation lies a deeper truth. Hubris often emerges where you've been undervalued, overlooked, or insecure, where you learned that visibility requires dominance and worth requires superiority. It is the emotion that reveals your longing to matter, a longing that becomes distorted when it's built on comparison instead of authenticity. Hubris becomes insight when we recognize the fear or insecurity hiding beneath the elevation. It becomes clarity when we understand that true confidence doesn't require superiority, only honesty. And it becomes growth when we allow ourselves to step down from certainty and step into curiosity. May we learn to meet hubris with compassion, not as a flaw, but as a signal that something in us is trying too hard to feel significant. For beneath every moment of hubris lies a longing for worth, stability, and recognition. A longing that becomes more powerful when paired with humility, truth, and care. Self-compassion. Self-compassion arrives as a gentleness, a quiet softening toward yourself in moments when you would normally tighten, criticize, or withdraw. It's the moment when you recognize your own pain and respond with care instead of judgment, with understanding instead of punishment. It doesn't inflate like hubris or collapse like shame. It soothes. It creates a warm internal presence that whispers, you're doing the best you can, and you deserve kindness too. Self-compassion is the feeling that says, I can offer myself the same care I would offer someone I love. Self-compassion is the emotional practice of treating yourself with kindness, patience, and understanding when you're struggling, hurting, or falling short. It emerges when you acknowledge your humanity, when you allow imperfection, or when you recognize that suffering is not a personal failure. Self-compassion simplifies the moment by reducing self-criticism and creating space for healing, clarity, and resilience. At its core, self-compassion is the emotion that says, I am worthy of care even when I'm hurting. Self-compassion is the quiet warmth that rises when you stop fighting yourself and start tending to the parts of you that feel overwhelmed, afraid, or ashamed. It is the emotional balm that forms when you speak to yourself with gentleness, when you soften your expectations, when you allow yourself to be human. Where perfectionism tightens and shame diminishes, self-compassion nurtures, offering comfort without excuses, honesty without cruelty. It is the moment when you place a hand on your heart, take a breath, and say, this is hard, and I'm allowed to be kind to myself. Self-compassion can shift your inner landscape, making mistakes feel like lessons instead of verdicts, making setbacks feel survivable instead of defining. It can make you more resilient, more grounded, more open. not because the pain disappears, but because you're no longer facing it alone. And yet, beneath this gentleness lies a deeper truth. Self-compassion often emerges where you've been hardest on yourself, where you've carried expectations that were too heavy, where you've forgotten that you deserve the same tenderness you offer others. It is the emotion that reveals your longing for inner safety, a longing rooted in the truth that healing begins with kindness. Self-compassion becomes insight when we recognize the moments where we've been unkind to ourselves. It becomes strength when we choose gentleness over judgment, patience over pressure, understanding over criticism. And it becomes healing when we allow ourselves to receive the care we so freely give. May we learn to meet self-compassion with openness, not as indulgence, but as nourishment for a tired heart. For beneath every moment of self-compassion lies a longing for safety, tenderness, and acceptance, a longing that becomes more powerful when paired with honesty, presence, and care. Perfectionism. Perfectionism arrives as a tightening, a subtle but relentless pressure to get everything right, to avoid mistakes, to meet standards that keep rising no matter how hard you try. It's the moment when effort stops being about growth and becomes about proving your worth, protecting your image, or preventing disappointment. It doesn't soothe like self-compassion or steady like humility. It constricts. It creates an internal demand that whispers, if I'm not flawless, I'm not enough. Perfectionism is the feeling that says, my value depends on getting everything right. Perfectionism is the emotional drive to meet unrealistically high standards, often fueled by fear of failure, judgment, or inadequacy. It emerges when your self-worth becomes tied to performance, when mistakes feel dangerous, or when you believe that only excellence will keep you safe. Perfectionism simplifies the moment by narrowing your focus to flaws, risks, and shortcomings, making it harder to see progress or perspective. At its core, perfectionism is the emotion that says, I must earn acceptance by being exceptional. Perfectionism is the quiet pressure that builds when you hold yourself to standards no one else asked you to meet, when you chase an ideal that keeps moving just out of reach. It is the emotional rigidity that forms when you fear that any imperfection will expose you, disappoint others, or confirm your deepest insecurities. Where pride affirms and shame diminishes, perfectionism demands, pushing you harder, faster, further, even when you're exhausted. It is the moment when you redo work that was already good, when you hesitate to start because you fear you won't excel, when you hide your efforts until they're polished beyond necessity. Perfectionism can distort your sense of identity, making you believe that your worth is conditional, fragile, or dependent on constant achievement. It can make you anxious, avoidant, or hypercritical, not because you lack ability, but because you fear what imperfection might reveal. And yet beneath this pressure lies a deeper truth. Perfectionism often emerges where you've been praised for performance, punished for mistakes, or taught that love must be earned. It is the emotion that reveals your longing for acceptance, a longing that becomes distorted when it's tied to achievement instead of authenticity. Perfectionism becomes insight when we recognize the impossible standards we've been holding ourselves to. It becomes clarity when we understand what we're afraid imperfection might expose. And it becomes healing when we allow ourselves to be human, to try, to learn, to grow without needing to be flawless. May we learn to meet perfectionism with compassion, not as a flaw, but as a signal that something in us is craving safety, acceptance, and rest. For beneath every moment of perfectionism lies a longing for worth, belonging, and ease. A longing that becomes more powerful when paired with self-compassion, honesty, and care. Guilt. Guilt arrives as a tug, a tightening in the chest, a heaviness in the stomach, a quiet awareness that your actions, words, or choices have caused harm or fallen short of your values. It's the moment when your conscience speaks up, when your integrity feels out of alignment, when you recognize the impact of what you've done. It doesn't collapse like shame or inflate like perfectionism. It alerts. It creates an internal discomfort that whispers, "This isn't who I meant to be." Guilt is the feeling that says, "I want to repair what I've damaged." Guilt is the emotional response to recognizing that your behavior has caused harm, violated your values, or affected someone in a way you didn't intend. It emerges when your actions and identity fall out of alignment, when empathy reveals the impact of your choices, or when you realize you could have done better. Guilt simplifies the moment by focusing your attention on responsibility, repair, and learning. At its core, guilt is the emotion that says, "I care about the effect I have on others." Guilt is the quiet ache that forms when your heart recognizes the gap between your intentions and your impact. It is the emotional signal that something needs attention, a conversation, an apology, a change in behavior, a moment of reflection. Where shame attacks the self and perfectionism attacks the standard, guilt illuminates the action, pointing toward repair rather than self-punishment. It is the moment when you replay what happened, not to punish yourself, but to understand how to make it right. Guilt can sharpen your awareness, making you more thoughtful, more careful, more attuned to the needs and feelings of others. It can make you reach out, take responsibility, or adjust your behavior, not because you're unworthy, but because you want to live in alignment with your values. And yet, beneath this discomfort lies a deeper truth. Guilt often emerges where you care deeply, where relationships matter, where your integrity is strong enough to acknowledge missteps. It is the emotion that reveals your capacity for empathy, accountability, and growth. Guilt becomes insight when we recognize what our actions taught us about our values. It becomes healing when we take responsibility without collapsing into self-attack. And it becomes transformation when we repair, learn, and move forward with greater clarity. May we learn to meet guilt with honesty, not as a burden, but as a guide toward integrity and connection. For beneath every moment of guilt lies a longing to do better, to be better, and to live in alignment with who we truly want to be. A longing that becomes more powerful when paired with courage, empathy, and care. Shame. Shame arrives as a collapse, a sinking in the chest, a heat in the face, a sudden urge to hide or disappear. It's the moment when a mistake, flaw, or judgment feels like a reflection of your entire worth, when the spotlight turns inward and becomes harsh and unforgiving. It doesn't alert like guilt or demand like perfectionism. It diminishes. It creates an internal voice that whispers, "There's something wrong with me." Shame is the feeling that says, "I am the problem, not just what I did." Shame is the emotional experience of believing that your flaws, failures, or imperfections make you unworthy of love, acceptance, or belonging. It emerges when you internalize criticism, when vulnerability feels unsafe, or when you fear that being seen will lead to rejection. Shame simplifies the moment by collapsing your identity into a single painful story about who you are. At its core, shame is the emotion that says, "If people knew the real me, they wouldn't stay." Shame is the heavy shadow that falls when you mistake a moment for a definition, when you confuse a behavior with your identity, when you believe that your worth has been compromised. It is the emotional contraction that makes you want to shrink, hide, or disappear, not because you don't care, but because you fear being seen in your most vulnerable state. Where guilt focuses on the action and perfectionism focuses on the standard, shame attacks the self, turning your inner world into a courtroom with no defense. It is the moment when your mind replays mistakes with cruel clarity, when your inner critic grows louder than your compassion, when you feel exposed even in silence. Shame can distort your sense of self, making you believe that you are unlovable, broken, or fundamentally flawed. It can make you withdraw, overcompensate, or numb out, not because you want to disconnect, but because connection feels dangerous when you feel unworthy. And yet, beneath this collapse lies a deeper truth. Shame often emerges where you long for acceptance, where you care deeply about how you're perceived, where you've been wounded by judgment or rejection. It is the emotion that reveals your desire to belong, a desire so strong that its absence feels like a threat to your very identity. Shame becomes insight when we recognize that it is a story, not a truth. It becomes healing when we separate who we are from what we've done. And it becomes transformation when we allow compassion from ourselves or others to reach the places where we feel most unworthy. May we learn to meet shame with gentleness, not as a verdict, but as a signal that something in us is longing for acceptance, safety, and connection. For beneath every moment of shame lies a longing to be seen, known, and loved. A longing that becomes more powerful when paired with honesty, courage, and care. When we self-assess, our emotions become reflections of our inner landscape. Humility shows us where we can grow. Pride reveals where we've honored our values. Hubris exposes the places where fear disguises itself as superiority. Self-compassion reminds us that kindness toward ourselves is essential for healing. Perfectionism highlights the pressures we place on our worth. Guilt guides us toward repair. And shame reveals the tender places where we fear we are unlovable. Together, these emotions show that self-assessment is not about judgment. It is about understanding. They remind us that growth requires honesty, that healing requires gentleness, and that our identity is shaped not only by what we do, but by how we meet ourselves in the aftermath. As this cluster closes, may we carry forward the courage to look inward with clarity, the compassion to hold ourselves with care, and the wisdom to recognize that every emotion we meet within ourselves is an invitation to learn, to soften, and to become more fully who we are.